Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's Education USA information session. The topic for the session today is application to MS and PhD programs in the United States. We are very fortunate to have with us Zachary Burton, a fifth-year PhD scholar at Stanford University. And he is going to be doing this presentation. But before I hand it over to Zachary, I'd like to give a quick introduction to Education USA and USIEF. US-India Educational Foundation is a binational organization that was founded in 1950 following the signing of a treaty between the Government of India and the Government of the United States. The purpose of setting up this organization was to promote cultural and educational exchange opportunities between citizens of both countries, and we do this primarily by administering two programs. One is the Fulbright and the Fulbright Nehru Fellowships, and the second one is the Education USA program. The Education USA program itself is completely funded by the US government, and it comes under the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, which falls under the US Department of State. We are actually a global network of about 400 plus advising centers in 170 countries. And in India, there are 7 Education USA centers. 5 of these are hosted by US India Educational Foundation and are in the cities of Delhi, Kolkata, Mumbai, Hyderabad and Chennai. And we also have 2 independent Education USA centers in the cities of Bangalore and in Ahmedabad. With that brief introduction to our organization, I'm now going to hand it over to Zachary for his presentation on application to MS and PhD programs in the US. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much. It's great to see all of you out here thinking about applying to grad schools. So to start off, I'll just ask, how many of you are thinking of applying to MS, MBA, MPH, other master's programs? 1? Okay, we've got a few. How about any for PhD programs, considering PhD programs? We've got a couple. Perfect, okay, perfect. Well, good. So, as you know, I'm currently in a PhD program, and so I'll mostly be, hopefully providing some insight about the PhD application process. I'll touch a little bit on applying to master's programs, but the truth is I'm not entirely familiar with that process, so you're much better suited to go to the folks here at Education USA and really take advantage of their resources and their knowledge. So that's what I'll just start us off with, is really a recommendation to go to them with any questions, even questions about the PhD process from here on out. And so again, you're probably here because you're curious about grad programs. And this is perfect because I'm currently in a grad program in the US, so I can speak to that a little bit. And so to start off with, I'll just give a little bit of my own, backstory, so you get, and this is really to sort of get a sense of the diversity of people who are, generally in grad programs. I think a big thing you'll find, especially if you're considering a PhD program, is, it is a significant time commitment, anywhere from, 4 to sometimes 8 years or so. And so really, it will become part of your life, and that has very much become my experience. Or I should say, it will become your life. It won't just be part of your life. And so for me, I'm in the final year of a PhD. I'll be graduating next year in the summer. And I'm studying geological sciences with a focus on energy resources, but covering all things related to marine geology in New Zealand. And so I was born in California, actually very close to Stanford, but mostly grew up between Spain and Germany, so have moved around a good amount. Did my undergrad in the state of Maine, which is a sparsely populated state in New England in the northeast of the US. And then I went straight from my undergrad program for my bachelor's into a PhD program. So that's something I want to emphasize as the last point here, is I didn't do a master's prior to going in. And so there's, what you'll find is, there's a mix in PhD programs. There's some who are coming straight from bachelor's, but there's others who've done a master's beforehand. And it's something I'll touch on later, is for those of you who are uncertain about the PhD program or would just like a taste of research, the MS degree before applying to PhD would be really useful for that. And so at Stanford, and I'm happy to field questions about any of these areas. But another thing you'll find is, it's good, just beyond your own program, whether you're in a master's or a PhD, to find some time to really enjoy the location that you're based in and to take advantage of some of the resources of your university or other local organizations. So I'm active with the GSB there, the Graduate School of Business. That's actually why I'm here in Chennai, is working through them. Active in energy policy, earth sciences, theater, and mental health advocacy as well. And then I've sort of added on research at NASA, which is close by within Palo Alto, so close to San Francisco, which is where Stanford is located. So that'll just be something I encourage as you shape your own journey through graduate school, is really finding a time for your passions, and whether it's 2 years in a master's program or whether it's 8 years in a PhD program, it's really a time. It really is a journey of self-discovery in many ways, and sort of deciding what you want to dedicate yourself to in your life. And so this, as far as my life, adjacent to the PhD program, this is my office. So that's been, you sort of craft your own space. And then this is just snapshots of my life in Palo Alto. So we have a bunch of chickens. We have like 20 chickens or something like that. So that's a bit atypical. You probably won't have chickens, but this is just sort of to illustrate that, you can enjoy the journey while you're going through these grad programs. And so before we dive into talking a bit more about the PhD process, which is what I'm familiar with, I'll just do a brief note on at least my perspective on going for an MS versus going for a PhD. And so I think this is maybe less applicable if you're considering an MBA or an MPH or any sort of other professional master's degree. Sometimes maybe a master's in engineering as well. Because those are especially useful for job specialization or for building out particular skills to pursue your career. Whereas what I'll be touching on is sort of more the research path, especially through the PhD. And so first, just some benefits for the master's. The master's is relatively short, so it's an easier time commitment than committing to the 4 to 8 years of a PhD, for instance. A downside in master's programs is they usually aren't funded. So usually you won't be getting paid to go through a master's program. There are exceptions. So for instance, some departments at Stanford do offer funding for master's students. They do pay their master's students. With a PhD, it is sometimes funded. This is usually especially true if you're considering doing a PhD in the sciences, so in any STEM field, sciences, maths, etc. Usually in the humanities, it's a little bit more difficult. The issue of funding is a little bit more pressing. And because of this longer time commitment, the PhD can be more expensive if you don't have funding, or if you have to go out and find your own funding. So that's another consideration. As I mentioned, the master's is great for job specialization. So this is really good beyond your bachelor's to build out some relevant skills and to really prove your mastery of a field, and to really sort of prove that expertise that you have built, being ready to launch into a career. So in some cases, or in some sense, the master's might be thought of as a more practical degree, when you're thinking about career advancement. However, for the PhD, if you are thinking of a career in academia, so a job as a professor or a researcher, any sort of intensive research, oftentimes then the PhD becomes necessary. And also, it can definitely be a degree. And if you're committing to these 4 or 8 years, you should have some aptitude for, or some love of learning. You should be excited about the prospect to committing, a 20th of your life to a degree or something like that. So, and then as I mentioned briefly at the start, the master's can also be a good way to, so to say, test the waters or to try out research, to sort of get a taste of what a PhD program might be like. And so we have, in my group, for instance, there's about 50% of us who came straight from bachelor's, and there's about 50% of us in a group of about 15 students, 50% of us who have done a master's before. And so that's really, the master's is a good taste of research. It's 2 years. You usually have a set project coming in, and usually it's a little bit more straightforward than a PhD, because a PhD you're very much trying to decide on your own research projects and trying to figure out what you're going to be doing for your thesis. So really the master's is a good taste of what a PhD might be like. And this, I have this under PhD, but this is really, I think, applicable to both masters and PhDs. This is a way to sort of establish your expertise in a field, to show that you've really mastered some sort of, some subject, to show that specialization. And now another point on the MS, before we really move into the PhD application process, is that there's different kinds of master's degrees as well. So if you're considering an MS, you could do a course-based MS, so a master's that is primarily, it consists of taking classes, very similar to the bachelor's degree. Heavy course loads usually. And this is oftentimes true for professional degrees. This is oftentimes the case. So for instance, in an MBA, you aren't really doing research usually unless you have some adjacent project. Usually it's just courses, similar for MPA, engineering degrees. Usually those are course-based. And then, however, there are also those research-based masters. And again, those are a good taste of what a PhD might be like. And they can also be a good way, something I have seen is masters students, even when they're not necessarily interested in a PhD, they may take on a research project to do a specific case study that's applicable to a company or to some sort of sector that they want to enter. And that can be helpful when you're looking for jobs, to show that, hey, I've done this case study, I've done this project while a master's student, and to again sort of prove this expertise that we've been talking about. But then we're going to be moving into PhD territory. So as I mentioned, please defer to Education USA for further master's questions. This is what they do. They help you through this process, so they're a perfect resource for helping out. And so, as we start to talk about PhD here, this is just to give you a general idea of the timeline. And so a final note on the master's is usually the timeline for master's, you don't have to start quite as far in advance as a PhD. I mean, it's good to be thinking about the program a year in advance or so or more. But PhD, you really do have to start this process quite far in advance. So I would say, anywhere from a year or more, a year to 4 years, starting with your undergraduate degree, really start to build out your coursework and start to think about research projects you're doing during the summer, research internships you're doing while a student, really sort of building this expertise and building up this, basically a portfolio of projects that you'll be able to showcase when you're applying to the PhD program. And so, for instance, from my own experience, what I did is I actually only spent one summer of doing research in undergrad, and then spent my final year doing what was called a senior thesis, so basically a year-long project to produce a smaller version of what might be a master's thesis. But I had many friends within the field or within other adjacent STEM science fields who did start research after their first year of a bachelor's, after their second year, so quite early on in the process. So really be thinking about that. And then, the next step is to think about the grad programs you're actually going to be applying to. So somewhere, a year to 6 months in advance, actually start to contact the advisors. So this may. I don't know what. Okay, we're back on. Okay. This may be a sort of an intimidating step. I know it was for me, but I want to emphasize that it is critical to be reaching out to professors who you are considering working with. And I also have this, perhaps you may hear this less often, but you should contact the current graduate students who are working with that professor. That's both of those steps are absolutely critical, and that was something I did as well in advance to applying to PhD programs. And so for your advisor, you're starting to build that relationship. And when you're crafting your SOP, your statement of purpose, you can of course mention your conversations with your potential advisor. You can mention some projects you might be excited about, and that's something that you can start to sort of get a sense of through emails back and forth with potential professors you might be working with. So I emailed, maybe 10 professors or something like this in advance. And I'll say, sometimes it takes a while. They're busy, professors are busy. My advisor now, my PhD advisor, didn't write me back for maybe 3 months or so. That may be extreme. He's doesn't like email, but just be ready. It's a tough process. You've got to be sort of gritty, You've got to just got to keep at it. And same with contacting the graduate students. And so while with the professor, you can start to build ideas of the kind of research they're doing, and even if they're accepting students in general, whether it be MS or PhD. With the graduate students, what's useful is you can really build an idea of whether you'd be a good fit in the group or whether the advisor is a desirable or a good advisor to have, whether you would actually want to be in that group. And I'll talk about all of these points more later. This is sort of just a brief overview. Maybe in May or so, around 7 months to half a year prior to applying, I would recommend taking a GRE practice test, and that will allow you to build a strategy for studying for the GRE. So if you do quite well, you'll have to prepare less, but if you have some room for improvement, taking it that early gives you really some time to study for a few months, take an actual test, and maybe take a second actual test if you have to. So then I have this, half a year to 2 months prior, take the GRE itself. Of course, it's best to do your best job the first time around, because sometimes schools will ask you if you've taken it multiple times, and you'll have to report that. So it's always best to do a great job the first time around. Next up, you'll want to confirm with your recommenders. And so these are people who've worked closely with you during your bachelor's or during your master's or otherwise outside of school. And so, about 3 months prior, work on confirming those recommenders and also starting to draft your statement of purpose, which is really critical for this process, is the SOP. And then 2 months prior, you'll want to send your SOP, your CV, and other materials, so your CV or resume, to your recommenders, and that's to give them a sense of basically how you're selling yourself to these grad programs, how you're presenting yourself. So it's good to keep your recommenders in the loop on this process. And then, so maybe a month prior, in November or so, work on getting lots of edits back on your statement of purpose from trusted friends, trusted colleagues, family members, professors, advisors, etc. And then usually December, I know this may vary for schools, but usually December is when you're completing your applications, sending those in. And so this is more information on each of those points. And so what I would point out here is that the coursework, it's relatively straightforward to figure out what courses you need for a PhD or for a master's program. What courses are the so-called prerequisites to entering these graduate programs. And that information is usually available on, I would say almost always available, on the websites of the graduate schools you're intending to apply to. And so I would say it's critical at the same time that you're thinking about programs, or even further in advance, a few years, if you're planning your coursework, really just build a general sense of what type of coursework is required for the area that you're intending to go into and the degree that you're intending to pursue. I know for me, within geology, there were some programs that required maybe 3 years of physics, some program that required 0 years of physics. So it can vary a lot, even within the same discipline. So just think about that. That's pretty straightforward, though. As long as you're sort of planning throughout your bachelor's and your master's, you should be well suited. You should be set up to do well with the coursework. Then I would say research is absolutely critical. So any way you can, if you're thinking about a PhD, research isn't absolutely necessary for a master's. Oftentimes, basically strong performance in coursework is enough to get into a master's program. Research, of course, always helps, because in the end you have to think in the mindset of your professors. Even if they're teaching master's level courses, they're still research researchers usually. So these professors usually do keep research close to the heart, so to say. So usually they are somewhat passionate about the fields they're studying. So that research experience can be useful even for these master's programs. But I would say it's absolutely critical for the PhD program. And so any way you can, start to build up experience in research. Oftentimes this can be in your bachelor's program or definitely during your master's program if you take on a research project. But even think about, it doesn't necessarily have to be paid research, even if you're doing, say, voluntary research projects on the side while you're completing your bachelor's degree. You know, that's just very useful. And of course, the ideal, so what I have here is the ideal case, is the most ideal is if you can get on a publication during your bachelor's or during your master's. That just sort of proves that not only have you done research, but you've done meaningful research that's validated by the scientific community, and you also have some ability to communicate your findings. So that is the ideal. I didn't have a publication going in. I was working on one, but I didn't have one published by the time I was applying to grad schools. But I had presented at conferences on my research, so that's usually the more accessible way for bachelor students. Usually more common is to present at a few international conferences, maybe one, maybe two or three conferences. So really all these, what really publications and conferences both show are, again, just that your research has been externally validated by the greater scientific community. So that's really important. And then of course, with any research advisors who you have during this process, just work on building good relationships with them because they may be your potential recommenders when it comes time to apply to programs. Okay, and again, I did mention this is critical. This is reaching out to potential PhD advisors or MS advisors. So when I was applying to grad school, I was applying to both MS and PhD programs. And so I sort of kept my options open when I was contacting advisors. So even for the MS, it is, it's important to reach out to potential advisors. So I would say this is a critical component. And so when you write them, this is more of a logistical note. When you write them, keep it brief. So I look back on my emails recently, and most of them, maybe a paragraph, maybe say this is your field, your email field here. Maybe your email is as long as this red text, maybe a bit longer, but sort of just briefly, very briefly explaining why you're interested, how your background is well suited to their research group, and then also don't be shy and do ask if they're taking grad students currently, because sometimes they just aren't. I contacted 2 professors who were retiring that year, so they weren't able to take on students. So don't be shy and do ask. And I would just say, again, emphasizing keeping it brief because, again, as illustrated by my advisor taking 3 months to get back to me initially, these professors, their time is very limited. They're scanning, they're getting lots of emails, especially if they're a popular professor, they're getting lots of interested applicants. So keeping it succinct, really concise is important. And then this is just another, this is a note as well. This is something of a cultural note because I know for me it was an adjustment. But when you write to professors, never start your email with "Dear Sir." It's really important. One, they could be a woman, so you should know that. Two, it sort of feels detached, and so like within American culture, if you're applying to U.S. grad schools, it feels more detached. So it feels like you haven't done the research, you haven't found out their name even. So I would say, and what I did was always use a "Dear Dr. So-and-so." So here I have, "Dear Dr. Graham," and that's how you start your email. I know this seems like a small detail, but it's really important because I'm close to the application process process at Stanford for our program because we, as grad students, we also interview incoming potential grad students. And so I hear a lot of complaints about just these small details. So this is just an important detail. Just do your research, find out their name. And doctor is also a bit safer than professor. Professor is fine too, but sometimes people prefer the doctor title. So this is the safest bet. And then another critical point that I mentioned is reaching out to the current grad students. And this is both, this can be strategic because, maybe then your potential advisor will hear that you're being proactive and hear that you're talking to their grad students. And you can mention this in your SOP that I got some input from these students. So it can be strategic, but even more so, this is for you. This is for you to gather data to figure out if you think you would be a good fit in the program and if you would be happy in the program. So I've just included some more detail here about things you can ask, what type of manager is your advisor? Are they a micromanager? Are they bothering you all the time? Are they really hands-on? Are they guiding you through the process? Or are they very detached? Do you have a lot of freedom? Do you have a lot of flexibility? And of course there's pros and cons, there's benefits to either of those approaches. So depending on the style that you prefer, sort of try to figure out by asking current graduate students what the advisor is like. Also, ask about the research group in general, ask about group dynamics, all these kinds of things. And this, this is especially relevant for if you're going to be spending 4 to 8 years in a PhD program, but can also be helpful for the MS program, asking people if their quality of life is high, and that will vary a lot, So Stanford, of course, is a big school and has many different programs, and some students in some programs are happier than others in general. So this is a step for you to make sure you'll be happy during those years you're committing. And then another logistical note is when you're asking grad students, don't ask about salary, don't ask about the size of your office, and don't ask about class requirements because most of this, especially class requirements, those are all online. And then the salary and office things, that's more of a formality. It's just because in the mind of these advisors and in the mind of these graduate students, your motivation shouldn't be the salary or the perks. It should really, of course, be the research that you're doing. So sort of keeping in mind that these are people who are interested in research and that's their life. GRE, we talked about, again, taking a practice test early to sort of gauge where you're at, to see how you're doing. And I haven't taken GRE prep courses. I've heard, mixed reviews. Some I hear are pretty good, so do your research there if you decide to do a prep course, or if you can afford it, because sometimes they're expensive. So there's a lot you can do on your own with some of these GRE apps. You've probably heard of Magoosh and things like that, where, there's really in this technological age, there's an app for everything, including the GRE. And so then, as I mentioned, sometimes schools do ask if you've taken the GRE more than once. I don't think that's usually an issue if you have, but just know that you should be trying to do your best the first time around. And as you're familiar with these are just the 3 sections. There's the verbal and the quantitative are the big sections, and what you sort of get your X out of 170 score on, and then the analytical writing is essay-based critical thinking that's out of a 6. I think it's a 6. Anyway, okay, the recommendations, again, give your recommenders plenty of time, because remember, they, just like your potential grad advisors, these people are busy as well. Your recommenders are busy. So, ask them a few months in advance, maybe September or so if your apps are due in December. I've been, with this process, I would say giving them at least a couple, 2 to 3 months in advance, and then sending them a reminder maybe a month in advance, and then, continuing to check in with them. And again, a note on those recommenders is, make sure they know you well, make sure they will say good things about you as well, as much as you can. Of course, you probably won't be reading their recommendations, and you shouldn't be editing them. Most schools will say that you should not write your recommendations for yourself. That defeats the purpose. But do make sure that another thing that you'll want in your recommendations, as much as you can sort of determine from talking to your potential recommenders, is you of course want to stand out, and you want them to be able to share actual stories or anecdotes about their experience interacting with you, and how your attitude and your performance suits you well for these graduate programs. So you don't, for instance, you don't want a recommendation that says something like, Zach is very motivated, he has done a number of projects, and I think he would be a great fit for a graduate program. You know, and I've seen recommendations like that. I've seen half-page recommendations that are just filled with platitude, that are very generic, don't include any interesting details. So make sure they have a good basis to recommend you on. So maybe a research project, maybe you've taken 3 classes with this professor. And so from when I was applying, I had one professor who I had done an undergraduate and a bachelor's thesis project with, and then I had 2 professors who I had just interacted with within the university department and taking courses with. So don't be afraid, even if you don't have 3 research advisors, which I did from my bachelor's, that's fine. It's just professors who know you well, who know you not only as a good student, but also as a good person interacting within your department, within your university. And again, as I mentioned, just make sure those recommendations get in. I know even recommenders lose track of this timeline, so keep checking in with them. And just a point here is to make sure that the way you can strategize far in advance is to make sure you're building these strong relationships with potential recommenders. Okay, the statement of purpose, the dreaded statement of purpose. This is probably the most important part of your PhD application, from what I understand. And this is also the more intimidating. I know, of course, this is, for me, took the longest. And so what I want to offer as a point of encouragement is this is really your chance to stand out and to tell your own story in your own words, and to, in the case of a PhD program, to convey your passion for research and why you are excited about a career within research and within pursuing a PhD. And so some basics that should be covered in the statement of purpose. Remember, this also should be short. This should be 1 to 2 pages, 2 pages at a maximum. And so you should give your reasons for applying to a program. These, and again, remember that this should be conveyed more as a narrative, not as a statement of facts. This is absolutely not your resume. This is not your CV. This instead is some sort of narrative that, in the best case, is conveying passion. So give your reasons for applying, describe your preparation and your background, why you're a good fit, briefly touch on some possible research projects, and then briefly describe your future plans. And you can mention possible advisors. That was something I did in my statement of purpose. And so what I want to emphasize here is don't be afraid to take a bit of a risk in crafting your statement of purpose. So for mine, I tried to print it out, but I was having printer issues, so I was going to share it. But it's, I really did tell a story. I described the process of going to a lab, performing research on a specific instrument, and sort of just described the passions, the excitement that sort of came with doing this research, writing up this research, going to conferences. It was very much a narrative. I never stated like I have procured like 6 grants and received these awards. My GPA was, my grades were. None, like that doesn't belong there. That is all for your CV or your resume. That will become clear. They will ask for your GPA. They will ask for your GRE scores. Don't include it here. This is much more focused, again, really on your passion for research and illustrating that you're a good fit. Not only technically, so not only based on your technical skills that you built, but also just on your attitude and who you are as a person. This is their only chance, next to the letters of recommendation, to get to know who you actually are. And so we've spent some time on this slide, but again, it's because this is very important. And again, a final note is to ask for feedback and ask Ask for feedback from your recommenders, ask from other professors, trusted friends, parents, depends there. I know for me, for instance, my parents had no idea what geology was, let alone what writing a statement of purpose for a PhD program was. So it depends. Choose wisely. Okay, and these are some pro tips here. As I touched on early on, remember that this is your life. You're committing to 4 or 8 years in the case of a PhD, 2 years in the case of a master's. And so it should be fun at times. It's a significant chunk of time. So this is me and my advisor during our holiday party. So you'll have fun. These of course are very respected scientists, less respected scientists. These are good years. It really is an enjoyable and also a very challenging time, both for the MS and for the PhD. But so I think that the main things are, think not only about selling yourself as you're applying, but also think about taking care of yourself when you're selecting programs. So in a few months when you make those selections. So then I guess my top tips, and these in some ways are applicable to the MS program as well, but really compatibility with your PhD advisor, is more important than your research topic. That may sound strange, but it's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And so you could be doing the coolest research, the most amazing machine learning and AI or whatever. But you could have a horrible advisor, and that will make your 4 to 8 years just miserable. And I have plenty of friends who are doing innovative, cutting-edge research, but who do not enjoy their experience because their advisors may be a bit too hands-on or maybe a bit too hands-off. So choose wisely and think about your own learning style as you're asking current grad students and as you're asking your advisor about those group dynamics. This will be the most deciding factor on your happiness, because really your PhD advisor, they're your boss, and they're your boss for many years. And well, of course, you can always leave a program, of course. It's never the ideal, it's never what you go in intending to do, but in many ways, this is sort of your guaranteed boss for at least 4 years. So make sure the fit is right and do your research before committing to a program. Again, this also fits in that reach out to current students. That's sort of a top tip there. And then for the PhD at least, do start planning at least a year to 8 months or so in advance of those program deadlines. This shouldn't be, again, thinking about your own happiness. This won't really be something you're too happy with if you start trying to slap applications together a month or 2 months in advance of the deadline. It's just really not enough time. And also unfair to your recommenders, unfair in trying to reach out to potential advisors. And so just finally on the application itself, really pay special attention to your research experience, of course the statement of purpose, and your recommendations, because those are often most important. I know we'll do questions next, but I know there's often questions on your grade point average, so what your grades were, or on your GRE, and those are considerations for these grad programs, but especially for the PhD programs, usually they look more to these points of evidence that sort of show who you are as a person. So your statement of purpose, your letters of recommendations, and your experience. But with that, we can take questions. Happy to take any questions about the process.
So what we'll do is I'll repeat the question so that you can answer it, so that our online audience can hear the questions.
Perfect.
Right?
Perfect.
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
On behalf of my son, I am would like to apply for PhD program in computer-based music theory and acoustics in Stanford. Can you give more light on getting application and how competitive it
Okay,
is?
so the question is that this gentleman's son is looking to apply for a PhD program in music and acoustics at Stanford. So he's interested to know how competitive the application would need to be to get into a program like this.
Another information, he's a musician himself as well as he's a master's in computer science from US.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think it sounds like if he's already doing a master's in computer science and he's already a musician, it sounds like he has some of these base qualifications. I can't say how competitive any given program is. Those aren't even really numbers that are published. I think the only times admissions information is published is usually for professional degrees like a JD, an MD, or an MBA. Sometimes the information is available. It wasn't available when I was applying. But I guess the consideration is, yes, Stanford, of course, because of the name, is a competitive university. Usually any PhD program, though, is relatively competitive because a research group usually has, not very many slots. It's not like a master's program where there may be 200 students in mechanical engineering at Stanford. There will probably be 10 other students like him or so. So in that sense, it's quite competitive. But I would answer for everyone in applying to a school like Stanford. Don't be afraid to apply. You lose nothing but the application fee, which of course don't go and apply to 20 schools because that's too expensive and ridiculous. But I think something you touched on in the last session I attended is to choose, and this is something I did for bachelor's degrees. Choose maybe 2 or 3 top tier, very good schools, 2 or 3 mid tier, and 2 or 3 sort of safety schools or schools that are a bit easier to get into. That's maybe my recommendation, with the caveat that for a PhD, program fit is also very important. So I would say it will be competitive, I think, regardless, but I can't say, what % are admitted, for instance. Yeah.
Let me have a try.
Yeah, exactly.
The next question.
So I'm planning to apply for master's in science. So when you contact potential faculties in particular grad schools and you express your interest in a program and you share your research and CV, would they actually be able to influence your application decision?
Okay. So the question from a student in the audience is that the student is interested to pursue a master's degree in science, MS program. So the student wants to know is if they send their resume well in advance to a professor, would the professor be able to influence the admission decision when the application comes for evaluation in front of the admissions committee? Right?
I would say, again, it depends on the program. So for where I was applying, absolutely. For me, my advisor was the one who made the decision. So in some cases, absolutely, it absolutely does influence. In others, I know some schools instead, for both masters and PhDs, just admit candidates
to the department.
Yeah, exactly, to the department, strictly through their admissions committee, without really consulting professors. So again, it depends, but I think you have nothing to lose in contacting those professors. It can only help your case to reach out to these professors, even for MS programs and even in cases where it is more competitive. Because I know, for instance, I had a roommate who was a master's in mechanical engineering at Stanford, and he still had an advisor. You still have a primary advisor. So if you really hit it off, if you really establish a good rapport, a good relationship with these faculty, sometimes it does help your case, and in some cases, it is the decision. So.
I think I'd just like to add something here is sometimes professors receive so many emails that it would be really difficult for them to respond to every query that a student writing from pretty much all over the world. It'll be difficult for them to answer, and particularly at the master's level, I doubt they might really respond as much as for a PhD student. Yes, there might be more of a better response, I would say. But at the master's level, I don't think they might respond as much. They just receive too many emails. To expect them to answer every MS applicant's email, I think would be unfair, really.
That's a great point. Is also don't be discouraged if professors don't respond, because I had plenty of people who didn't respond. And I think that brings up a good point too. Is that when you're sending these emails, don't write an email and then send it to 10 professors. Yeah. Each email is crafted. Each email is specifically relevant to that professor's research. You want to show that you're putting care into it, because they're going to be putting care into selecting to bring you on for 5 years or so as a student, or for 2 years or so in the case of an MS.
Yeah, true, very true. All right, anybody else? Next question. Yes, please.
I would like to know what is the impact of work education after the completion of graduation and pursuing a PhD?
Okay, so the question from a member of the audience is, would having work experience be helpful in applying to a PhD program, right?
Yeah, I think certainly that adds to your background as a candidate. So I think if your work experience is relevant in a relevant industry, absolutely. So for instance, I have friends from my bachelor's who went on to complete, masters in education, or even EdD, so PhD in education. And in their cases, sometimes they worked for 2 or 3 years as a high school teacher or a primary teacher, and that helps their case. Within my field, what that could look like is, we have some students who, before their PhD and after a bachelor's or after a master's, they went to work, in the oil and gas industry for 1 to, anywhere up to like 8 years or more. So I think, to answer your question, it can really help out. And it can sort of serve the same purpose as research experience. It's showing that you do have some background and you're making an informed decision rather than just applying out of the blue to a program. Yeah.
So there was a question from, I'll come to your question. There's another question from an online audience member who wants to know, would the application process to the School of Mining be similar to the rest of the schools in Stanford, or is there any specific difference to that?
So that would be, we don't have a School of Mining, but anything covering mining would be in the same school that I'm in, which is basically our School of Earth Sciences. It's the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. And so generally, yes, all of the master's and PhD program applications for the School of Earth Sciences are usually the same timeline. So the timeline I presented for the PhD applications is, it starts much earlier, so say a year plus earlier, because, more preparation is needed for the PhD. But generally, that timeline should be applicable for most programs which have deadlines in, anywhere late November, December, early January. I think when I applied, it was early January. So, yeah.
You had a question?
How is applying for transport different from other universities?
Okay, so that's an interesting question we have.
Yeah.
How is it different applying to Stanford as compared to applications to other universities? Do you have to do anything extra to get into Stanford? Right? Yeah.
That's a great question. Another good point that brings up is, a lot of this is just, truthfully, a lot is just luck. Like applying to a school like Stanford, there could be 3 candidates who are all perfectly qualified. Maybe none get in, maybe they all get in, maybe one gets in. So in that regard, the main difference would probably be that, it is extremely selective, and many people do just send an application that way, just because why not? And so I think, again, the way to differentiate yourself is really to spend some time doing your research as you apply. But then, in many ways, this process that I described is sort of PhD program wide, any PhD program. This should be true whether you're, wherever you're applying. So in that regard, the process of applying to Stanford isn't too different from other PhD or graduate programs.
How a lot of students have asked me, since they knew you were going to do this session, is how important is it that you have to have a GRE score of upwards of 325 on 340, or a GPA of, in India we have a scale of 10.
Yeah.
So maybe is it necessary that you must have a GPA of over 8.5 or 9 to get into a university like Stanford? How important are the academic performance of a student, and would that sort of, at the first level, would their academics and GRE score help them to get to a certain level of selection, and then only would their SOP or an LOR matter? So how would the professors really look at things?
Again, I'm sorry that so often the answer is it depends, but it really does for programs. I know I was for instance, looking at one of the best geology, so Penn State has one of the best geology programs in the world, and I was looking, they did publish their average GRE scores, and it was something like a 310,
Okay.
which isn't, it's
Doable.
not crazy.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
a crazy score. And so it does vary based on the program. And I know for Stanford geology, for instance, GRE and GPA are maybe the third and fourth most important, maybe the fourth and fifth most important, whereas research experience, statement of purpose, letters of recs, top three, easily top three. And I think to also partly answer that question, especially for PhD programs, the GRE and GPA, there's a little bit more flexibility. It's a little less important. The hard thing, I think, like you were saying with advisors who get so many emails for MS programs, is that oftentimes the GRE and GPA, they do use it to filter candidates because they're just getting so many applicants. That can even be true for PhDs as well. I know, I think our geology program as a whole, the admissions committee filters out the bottom 50% based on GRE, GPA, initial screening, and then they pass on the next few. So the answer is, it can't hurt to have a high score either way.
Right.
Do your best, but don't be completely discouraged if you have, if you have like a 300 or something like this on the GRE, or there's flexibility, and that's where your SOP and your letters of rec and your research experience and your work experience can help make a better case for you. Yeah.
Okay. So there was some question from the audience. Yeah, I'll come to you.
Yeah.
When we
Give
talk
the others a
about
chance.
funding for PhD program, then it's easier for the STEM
Yeah.
courses. And if you look for the humanities, is that the case all across the US, or is it Stanford specific?
That's across. So most of what I would say everything I presented is across the US. I tried not to, this isn't a Stanford specific presentation, it's more just PhD specific. So I would say that's generally true. I think at Stanford, usually humanities are funded, I think. But I know with other universities, usually STEM is funded, but humanities can be pretty difficult to get funding from the university for PhD programs. But again, that requires just some research on your part to see what the funding situation is.
So there's a question there. Yeah. I'll come to you.
So I'm interested in stem cells. I'm interested in doing stem cells when I a PhD, but I'm applying right now for MS. So do I have a brighter chances of getting a PhD as soon as I finish my MS, or will I need to take a year break for some work experience and then?
Okay, so a student here in the audience is interested in doing perhaps in the future a PhD in the area of stem cells, if I understood correctly. But currently she's applying for a master's program, and what she'd like to know is if she should take a gap year after the master's and get some work experience before applying to the PhD program, and would that improve her chances of getting into the PhD program?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think actually my answer would be different if you were applying right from your bachelor's, because I think usually it's a little bit harder applying from bachelor's to go straight into a PhD, because you do want research experience or work experience. And so I think doing a master's first is a very, that alone can serve as, good, basically a good indication of your skills and that you can do this research. I would say my only recommendation is just make sure you're doing some sort of research project doing the master's. But that said, so I don't think it's necessary to answer your question. But that said, I do have friends like in the biochemistry field who have gone to work a few years at labs at universities or labs at hospitals. So I think it can vary, especially in the medical field. There's a lot of people who will work as like a research associate for a few years. But I think the master's alone can serve as a display of your knowledge for applying to PhD programs.
Okay, so you had a question.
So actually for a course like electrical engineering, the graduate program, I do need to know that many schools do offer fall intake as well as spring intake. So while majority of the students in engineering choose the fall intake, Some do choose the spring intake. I want to know that if there would be any disadvantage seeking employment while you choose the spring intake. Because some students, most of the students at the end of their second semester do get into an internship. So how different is it for
Right.
fall
Okay.
and the
Yeah,
spring intake?
Okay. So we have a student from the audience wanting to know if the student were to join a university in the spring intake as against joining in the fall intake, which is more popular with students, would that impact the opportunities for getting an internship? For the student if he were to take the spring intake. That's the question the student had.
Yeah, I don't know actually. I mean, my theory would be that maybe you have less classes on your CV to show these companies hiring for internships. What I do know is that usually the hiring for internships is usually in the fall. So you would be entering in the spring, and then you would have maybe a quarter or a semester to prepare. So you would just have a little bit less time to prepare than other students. That said, if you did spring intake and the few months before that you were doing an internship or you were doing some sort of work, that could help. So I think it varies on the case, but that would be
I'd
my
just like
thought.
to add
Yeah.
that it might also depend. As an international student, you might have to complete certain credits before you're eligible to apply for an internship in some schools. Perhaps it could be depending on the course, department and the university you're applying to. There might be certain restrictions on that. As an international student, you might have to complete one semester or even 2 semesters before being allowed to apply for an internship. So you might want to check that first with the university that you're applying to if there are any such restrictions. Again, those will vary from course to course, department to department and university to university. So that is the other thing I would say check on before you figure that out. Yeah. Any other questions? So I've had a question from a student of mine who wrote earlier to me saying that the student had 2 publications in his area of study, but then the PhD area or the master's come PhD, and he wants to go into that MS PhD track kind of a program.
Yeah.
But the field of study that he's considering for that MS PhD track is slightly different from his undergraduate major. So would that, and so the 2 publications that he has already published in scientific journals are for the major that he is doing at his bachelor's degree currently, but has no correlation to the subject that he wants to do his MS PhD in. So how much would that impact his chances of admission to a PhD program?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I guess first it's pretty incredible to have 2 publications when applying, regardless of the field, I think. Because my case was actually very similar. I had 0 publications,
Right.
but within geology, I was applying to do something very different, extremely different. And so it's definitely possible, and I think those publications will just help that student out. Because I think, again, I was actually reading an article on this, was that so quickly, especially like within STEM and now to humanities and sort of these newer technologies for studying things, so quickly does technology become obsolete, and change. So I think changing fields is also something is pretty widely accepted, and that's okay. At least for me in this case, near the end of a PhD, it's almost always the case that for like a postdoc, you should be, or you are encouraged to do something different from what you studied. So I would say go ahead with the application and highlight those publications.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a question from an online viewer, Matangi. Should the master's thesis be relevant to what you were applying for PhD?
All right. So we have a good question from an audience member called Matangi. Should the thesis project paper be the topic for that paper be similar to the subject that you're applying for in the PhD? So perhaps you could answer.
Yeah, I think similar. It's sort of a similar question. I would say it doesn't have to be. And so I know plenty of people who have studied the same topic in geology from undergrad through a master's now to a PhD. But I know plenty of people who've completely switched topics. I have a friend at Stanford who is in the PhD in education program, but did an MS in SIA, in computer science. So, it really varies a lot. And there's no, I think a good thing about a lot of these programs in the US is you're usually you're not barred or you're not prevented from applying just because your degree is in a different specialization.
So I think here also, what I'd like to add is perhaps this is the opportunity for the student to speak about why they're passionate about this new field of study in their statement of purpose. The SOP gives you that opportunity to highlight why you're switching your major or why you're very passionate about doing something. And I think that's what the professors in the admissions committee would like to read and understand as to why the student is making that change, I think. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's I'll say related is if you are changing fields, you will probably have to explain that at some point, and the SOP is a perfect place to do that, like you said. That's perfect. Yeah.
Any other questions? Any final questions from our
Anything,
audience?
really. You can ask anything.
Yeah.
PhD. I've been there 4 years. I've seen it all. So don't be afraid. Any questions about applications, about quality of life, anything else?
Okay, so let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
When you're applying for a PhD program and you're writing to a professor, can you outright ask the professor if any funding will be available for the PhD program, or is that something you should wait to get admission first and then you should ask that question?
No. No, that's a great question. And I would definitely not. Well, you can wait to gain admission, but don't accept an offer before you know the funding situation.
Right.
So you can ask what I did. I didn't really ask about funding when I was writing. I more asked this question of, are you taking students? Are you taking MS or PhD students? What are their thoughts on that? And then I think I wouldn't ask it right away.
Okay.
I wouldn't ask it in the first email just because sometimes the funding is a little bit of, it's a sensitive topic. Delicate, exactly, absolutely. So I wouldn't ask right away because it might scare them off. But like when you're visiting a grad school, or when even, maybe sometimes when you're, this could be a good place for speaking with current grad students, is you can ask questions related to that, like, how many grants do you apply to? Do you apply for fellowships? Do you apply to funding? Do you apply for conference travel?
Correct.
So you can sort of get that answer without being like, hey, will I be paid? Like, but yeah, treat it delicately, which is also why I don't recommend asking, right away about like the salary or about the size of the office or, because though I mentioned like quality of life is super important, you want to lead with the research.
Exactly.
You want to start on the right foot. So.
Related to this, I'd like to know if a student is doing research on the department page, and how is one to find out how much funding is available within the department? Is there any possibility to find out that the department has so much of research funding available, or a particular professor has so much funding available for research in their area of specialization? Is that any way to find out that information on the website?
I don't think so on the website. The only thing I have seen is that sometimes, usually newer professors, young professors, will have their own personal webpage, and on that site they'll say, I'm currently taking students, or like I'm looking for new MS or PhD students, please contact me. So that's an indication, but there usually unfortunately, there usually aren't figures about funding. And it varies for department. I know Stanford, each professor in geology gets 2 students funded by the university, and then the rest have to be other means of funding. And that varies depending on what university or what department you're in. So I wish the answer were yes, but I don't think so.
Right, so we'll go with that final question. Yeah.
So most of these students, they don't apply for RA or TA.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any difference between students who reside in US and the international students who apply for the RA TAs?
Okay, so the question from an audience member was about receiving a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship, and he would like to know whether if it matters whether you're an international student or a domestic US citizen student in terms of being able to receive the TA or the RA, or basically the question is, on what basis would you be able to get a TA or an RA, irrespective of what your student status is?
Yeah, I don't know about international versus American students for RA or TA, but that is a great option, like the RA or the TA for funding a master's, or in cases for also funding the PhD. So for instance, I'm technically an RA. But what that means is it's not an extra obligation. It just means I'm doing the PhD and I'm an RA. And sometimes there are also TA requirements, so you're actually teaching. But for masters, I think the RA TA question is especially useful because usually you have to pay for the masters, and so then the RA TA can be a way to offset that. But unfortunately, I don't know the answer as to whether it's more difficult for international or American citizens to get the RA or TA. That would be a good thing to ask about through department, sort of the department webpage or the department coordinator. That's another good point on questions. Actually, that's a really good point on questions about salaries, funding, RA, TA. Is a lot of times these departments, so say the Department of Geology or the Department of Applied Mathematics, they'll oftentimes have a coordinator or a manager who's separate, who's not a professor, and who can sometimes maybe answer some of those questions about salary that you wouldn't really want to ask the professor or the grad students. So
you could start by perhaps writing to the graduate admissions office, asking them, and there'll be, for international students, there'll be a specific email ID provided that you could write to. And if the graduate admissions office doesn't have any specific answer for your question, then they might themselves direct you to somebody in the department who's like an admissions coordinator for that department. And they perhaps would be able to answer if you are eligible to apply or not. Also, typically from what we have seen is that most universities in the US now are offering the TA or the RA only from either the second semester in some cases, and in some universities only in the second year perhaps. So also your first semester academic performance will also matter. And in some cases it also depends on the availability of funding in the department, whether they can give it to you after the first semester, or sometimes you might only be able to get something in the second year. But then there are students, I can give you an example of an advisee of mine who went to Washington State University, a computer science student. So he was on a non-thesis track in the first semester, but his grades were very good, 3.9 out of 4 in the first semester, and the professors invited him to switch to the thesis track. And they said that they could consider him for funding if he were to switch, and he switched to the thesis track from the second semester, was able to get full tuition waiver and a $2,000 stipend per month. So it depends on the student's profile, availability of funding with the professor, all of this, so it all depends. Like you said, it depends is the key word. Yeah. All right, any last questions? Otherwise we'll close for today. Yeah. All right, since there are no more questions, I'd like to quickly just take that clicker, just share some information about our contact details.
Looking to study in the US but don't know where to start? Education USA is your official source of information on US higher education. And now it's available anytime, anywhere through the Education USA India mobile app. Use our simple 5-step checklist to begin and track your higher education journey. Chat with our answer bot to get tips and unbiased information on shortlisting universities, scholarships, standardized tests, student visas, and a lot more. Share your profile information with an Education USA advisor for help. Get notified and register for Education USA fairs, information sessions, and events near you. What's more, learn about student success stories and access useful resources on our social media platforms. All on the Education USA India mobile app. It's official, free, and just a tap away. Download it now.
Right, so with that little plug for our Education USA India mobile application, it's free to download on the Android as well as the iOS platform. You can find a lot of answers to some of your questions about studying in the US in the app itself, and you also have an opportunity to send an email to an Education USA advisor who will respond to your query by an email. Finally, just to share with you some of the resources that we have where you can learn more about US higher education. So we have the Facebook page, Education USA India, and our YouTube page, which is Education USA India again. We have a lot of videos on our YouTube page which are free for students to watch. So basically these videos cover pretty much every step of the US university application process. On our Facebook page we post regularly information about our upcoming events, scholarship alerts, any news that we've received from US universities about new majors or programs and things like that. So do keep track of our Facebook page to get that information. Please do visit the official Education USA website, educationusa.state.gov. You can learn about the 5 steps to US study both at the undergrad and the graduate level, and to also check on what upcoming events we're organizing at the various Education USA centers. You could visit the US India Educational Foundation website and look up our calendar of events, and you will learn more about the upcoming sessions or webinars or fairs and other events that we're organizing. And of course, we also do twice a month on 2 Saturdays at 10 a.m. We also do these webinars where either an Education USA advisor or a US university professor or an admissions representative will talk about a particular step of the US university application process. So again, if you were to visit our USIF website, the calendar of events will have details of the topics for the upcoming webinars. And in Chennai, of course, typically we normally organize the information sessions on a Thursday, but since Zach was available only today, we're doing this on a Monday today. But otherwise, normally our information sessions are on a Thursday. Twice a month at least we try and organize these sessions here at the American Center. So again, once again, if you visit the USIF website, on the calendar of events you'll be able to find out what our upcoming sessions are. And finally, of course, don't forget to download our Education USA India mobile app. You can reach out to us through the app, but you'll also be able to get a lot of information that's already there on the app. All right? So with that, I'd like to thank Zachary for taking time out of his rather very busy schedule, considering he's going back to the US in another 2 days. But it was very kind of him to take time out and talk to us, and we're privileged to have him here because it's not always easy to catch a current PhD student to give a talk. So we're fortunate that he's able to share his own experience and of what it takes to apply, not just to Stanford, but to other universities in the US. And thank you so much to our online audience and in-house audience who've joined us today. Thank you.